The cold of the linoleum floor seeped through the thin mattress, a damp chill that felt bone-deep. Eleanor lay awake, her body aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. The only sound in the oppressive darkness was the low, relentless hum of the refrigerator, the mechanical heartbeat of a house that was not hers. Beside her, her 7-year-old son, Leo, breathed softly, his small form curled into a ball for warmth. A wave of love so fierce it was painful washed over her, immediately followed by the cold grip of terror. She could smell the faint, greasy aroma of someone else's dinner lingering in the air, a ghost of a comfort she couldn't provide. The scent made the gnawing emptiness in her own stomach feel sharper, more acute. She felt a familiar knot of nausea tighten in her throat. Every shadow in the strange kitchen seemed to stretch and writhe, mocking her with silent whispers of her failure. Sleep was a distant country she could no longer visit. There was only the hum, the cold, and the crushing weight of being a guest whose welcome was about to expire in 2 short days. Her fingers, calloused from years of pushing needles through stubborn fabric, trembled as she quietly opened her worn-out purse. The click of the metal clasp echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She carefully unfolded the sum of her entire existence, 2 creased $10 bills and a single, tired $25. She smoothed the bills onto the thin mattress, the faces of long-dead presidents staring up at her with blank indifference. This paltry sum was a shield, a wall, and a prayer all at once. It had to stretch. It had to become food. It had to become a bus ticket to... where? The question was a vast, empty void in her mind. Just last week, there was more, but food for Leo had devoured it. The memory of the eviction notice, a bright orange scar taped to her door, burned behind her eyes. The landlord's face, a mask of cold apathy, was a permanent fixture in her nightmares. A hot wave of shame washed over her, making her skin prickle. Her son deserved a room with a real bed, not this. He deserved the simple dignity of a home, not a borrowed floor with the street waiting just outside. Her heart felt like a stone, heavy and cold in her chest. This temporary sanctuary was a cruel paradox. Mrs. Gable's kindness, offered with a voice full of pity that stung like nettles, was a double-edged sword. It was a roof over their heads, but it came with a terrifyingly short expiration date. 2 days. The words were a relentless drumbeat against the inside of her skull. 48 hours until they were homeless again. Eleanor pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, a desperate attempt to physically stop the tears from forming. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. It would only leave her with a pounding headache and frighten Leo if he woke. She had to be strong, but her composure felt like a cheap costume, its seams splitting under the strain. A sudden, violent shiver racked her body, a cold that had nothing to do with the chilly linoleum. It was the icy touch of pure, undiluted panic. The image of walking out that back door, holding Leo's small hand with nowhere to go, made her breath hitch in her throat. Her stomach clenched into a tight, painful knot. She felt like she was drowning in molasses, the air growing thick and heavy, the surface of the water impossibly far away. She was completely and utterly alone. A sliver of moonlight cut through the kitchen window, illuminating her son's sleeping face. He looked serene, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. He was her anchor, the one reason she hadn't shattered into a million pieces. He was also the source of her most profound and visceral terror. How could she possibly shield this innocent child from the harsh reality waiting for them? Tucked tightly in the crook of his arm was his most prized possession, a small red rubber ball, its surface worn smooth with use. It was the last remnant of their old life, a pathetic souvenir from a time when she still had her own sewing machine, her own small apartment, and the fragile currency of hope. She remembered the day she bought it for him, a simple joy that now felt like a memory from another person's lifetime. Now, all that hope had curdled into a constant, gnawing anxiety that chewed at her insides. He deserved a real childhood filled with laughter and scraped knees, not this quiet, fearful existence on the run. He deserved a home. The weight of her failure to provide one felt like a sickness, a fever burning through her veins, leaving her weak and hollowed out. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to mock her, growing louder as it marked the passing of each precious second. The countdown had begun. With a ragged, shallow breath, Elena forced herself to sit up. The damp cold of the floor instantly soaked through her thin clothes, a jarring shock to her system. She couldn't just lie here, paralyzed by fear, waiting for the inevitable. She had to do something. Anything. A hazy memory surfaced. The cluttered community bulletin board at the local supermarket. A chaotic mess of lost pet flyers and handwritten ads for odd jobs. It was the definition of a long shot, a desperate grasp at a straw in a hurricane. The sheer humiliation of pinning her family's survival on a random scrap of paper made her stomach churn. But it was an action. It was a move, and it was infinitely better than simply waiting for the clock to run out. A tiny, frantic spark ignited in the abyss of her despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was the raw, primal instinct of a mother refusing to surrender. She had to try. What would you do in her place with just 2 days to find a home for your child? If you believe in the power of a mother's will to survive, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on to follow Elena's incredible journey. The oppressive heat of the supermarket was a stark contrast to the chill of the previous night. The air was thick with the cloying scent of overripe fruit and disinfectant, a combination that made Elena's empty stomach churn. She pushed through the crowded aisles, her son Leo trailing behind, his small hand clutching the back of her shirt. She felt the impatient stares of other shoppers, their carts overflowing with a bounty she could only dream of. A wave of shame, hot and suffocating, washed over her. She navigated to the back of the store, toward the corkboard cluttered with faded flyers and handwritten pleas. It was a monument to quiet desperation, a place where people posted their last-ditch hopes. Her eyes scanned the chaotic collage of paper, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt a knot of dread tighten in her gut. This was a fool's errand, a waste of precious, dwindling time. She was about to turn away when a small, yellowed index card, pinned askew in a corner, caught her eye. The ink was faded, the paper curled at the edges, but the words were clear enough. Caretaker needed, vacant property. Inquire within. Below it, a phone number. The words vacant property echoed in her mind. It wasn't a job, not really. It was a lifeline, a place, a roof. The possibility, however faint, sent a tremor through her. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, fumbled in her purse for the single quarter she had set aside for this exact purpose. The grimy, claustrophobic phone booth on the street corner smelled of stale cigarette smoke and despair. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart in her ears as she dialed the number, the metallic clicks of the rotary phone sounding unnervingly final. A man answered on the second ring, his voice not unkind, but clipped and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the sound of business, of billable hours. Eleanor explained her situation, her own voice sounding small and reedy, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush. He listened without interruption, the silence on his end of the line stretching her nerves to their breaking point. When she finished, there was a long pause. "The Caldwell estate," he said finally, his tone flat and sterile. "I am the executor. The property is in probate. It is not habitable." The word hung in the air, a clear warning. But Eleanor heard only one thing: vacant. The lawyer, a Mr. Henderson, agreed to see her. His office was in a tall glass building downtown that seemed to scrape the sky, a world away from the cracked pavement and peeling paint of her reality. The air inside was chilled and smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. Elena felt acutely out of place in her worn-out clothes, a ghost haunting a palace of wealth. Mr. Henderson was a man made of sharp angles and cold surfaces. He didn't offer her a seat so much as gesture vaguely toward a chair, his eyes never leaving the thick file on his desk. He explained the situation with the same dispassionate tone he'd used on the phone. The mansion was tied up in legal battles. It couldn't be sold or rented, but it was being vandalized. He needed someone on site, a presence to deter troublemakers. He tapped a manicured finger on a floor plan. "There's a basement," he said, still not looking at her. "It has its own entrance. You can live there. No rent. Just be there." The offer was a strange mix of salvation and insult. A basement. He was offering her a hole in the ground, but it was a hole with a lock. It was a place to put their mattress. It was safety. 1,000 questions swirled in Elena's mind, but she swallowed them all. She couldn't afford to seem ungrateful. She couldn't afford to lose this one bizarre chance. She just nodded, a lump forming in her throat that made it hard to speak. "Yes," she managed to whisper, "Thank you." Mr. Henderson slid a single, heavy iron key across the polished expanse of his desk. The metal was cold against her skin. "This is for the basement door. Don't lose it. Don't bother me unless the house is on fire. Is that clear?" He finally looked at her then, his eyes a pale, chilly blue, and she felt like a specimen under a microscope. He saw her desperation, and it bored him. She felt her face flush with a familiar, hot shame. She was a problem he was solving in the most expedient way possible. Grasping the key, she mumbled her thanks again and quickly left the office, the sterile, cold air following her out into the humid street. The iron key felt impossibly heavy in her pocket, a cold, hard lump that was both a promise and a burden. The hope she felt was fragile, a tiny flickering flame she had to shield against the wind. The bus ride was long and jarring. The vehicle groaned and wheezed its way out of the city, the urban sprawl slowly giving way to manicured suburbs. And then, finally, to sparse, open countryside. The smell of diesel fumes and hot vinyl was suffocating. Leo, initially excited by the adventure, had fallen asleep, his head resting heavily on her lap. Elena stared out the window at the passing landscape, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach with every mile. The lawyer's word, isolated, came back to her. The houses grew farther and farther apart, separated by wide, unkempt fields and dense patches of woods. A sense of profound loneliness began to creep over her, a feeling of being untethered from the world. The bus driver called out her stop, a lonely post by the side of a two-lane road with no sidewalk. As the bus pulled away with a hiss of air brakes, a cloud of dust and a deafening silence descended. They were utterly alone. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The road to the Caldwell estate was a half-mile walk, the lawyer had said. It looked more like a forgotten trail. The walk was an ordeal. The gravel road was uneven and overgrown with weeds that snagged at her ankles. Eleanor shifted the weight of their single, heavy bag from one aching arm to the other, while her free hand held tightly to Leo's. The late afternoon sun beat down on them, but the air held a strange, damp chill, especially as they passed under the canopy of the tall, ancient trees that lined the path. The silence here was different from the city's quiet moments. It was a heavy, watchful silence, punctuated only by the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the cawing of distant crows. Every snapped twig underfoot made her jump. A shiver, unrelated to the temperature, traced its way down her spine. This wasn't just isolation. It was abandonment. The world felt like it had fallen away, leaving only this overgrown path and the oppressive woods. Leo, now fully awake, squeezed her hand tighter, his small face etched with an uncertainty that mirrored her own. "Are we almost there, Mama?" he asked, his voice a small whisper in the vast stillness. Her heart ached. "Almost, sweetie," she lied, her own hope beginning to fray, and then they saw it. The mansion wasn't grand or beautiful. It was a carcass, a hulking, dark shape looming at the end of the road, partially swallowed by decades of unchecked nature. Grey, weather-beaten wood, dark patches of rot, and windows like vacant eyes, most of them boarded up from the inside. A thick mantle of ivy crawled up one side, its tendrils prying at the siding like skeletal fingers. The roof sagged in the middle, and a chimney listed at a precarious angle. The place didn't just look empty. It felt malevolent, steeped in a deep and profound sadness. A rusty, wrought-iron fence, bent and broken in several places, encircled the property. The main gate hung from a single hinge, frozen half open in a permanent, unwelcoming sneer. The scent of decay was stronger here, a mix of wet, rotting leaves and something else, something sour and old. Elena's stomach dropped. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a tomb. The fragile hope she had so carefully nurtured shattered into a million icy shards. This was a terrible mistake. Finding the basement entrance took them around the side of the hulking structure, through knee-high weeds that soaked the cuffs of her pants with cold dew. Tucked away under a crumbling stone archway was a heavy, dark wood door set low into the foundation. It had no knob, only a large, black iron ring for a handle. It looked like the entrance to a dungeon. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She set down their bag, her muscles screaming in protest. The key Mr. Henderson had given her felt slick with sweat in her palm. It grated loudly in the rusty lock, the sound echoing in the unnerving quiet. With a deep breath, She pulled on the iron ring. The door resisted, swollen shut by years of damp. She put her shoulder into it, grunting with the effort, until it finally gave way with a deep, groaning screech of protest. A blast of air rushed out to meet them. It was a physical presence, colder than the outside air and heavy with the thick, suffocating smell of mildew, damp earth, and stagnant water. It was the smell of a place that hadn't seen sunlight in a generation. Taking Leo's hand, Elena stepped over the high threshold and into the gloom. The darkness was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that swallowed the faint light from the open doorway. She felt a moment of pure, claustrophobic panic as her eyes struggled to adjust. Her hand slid along the cold, slimy stone of the interior wall, searching for a light switch. Her fingers brushed against something, a string. She pulled it. There was a click and a single naked bulb, dangling from a long wire in the center of the vast space, flickered to life. It cast a weak, sickly yellow glow, pushing the shadows back, but not defeating them. What the light revealed made her breath catch in her throat. The lawyer had said, a basement. He hadn't said it was a cavern. It was a single, enormous room that stretched out into the gloom, far larger than her entire old apartment. There were no walls, no partitions, just a forest of thick stone pillars holding up the groaning weight of the house above. The scale of it was disorienting and deeply unsettling. The light was just strong enough to illuminate the surfaces closest to them, and what Elena saw made her feel sick. The stone walls were weeping. Glistening trails of moisture ran down the grey rock, collecting in dark, ugly puddles on the floor, huge, spidery patches of black and green mold spread out from the corners like a creeping disease, the source of the overwhelming stench that was already making her head ache. The air was so heavy and damp, it felt like she was breathing water. She could feel the chill of it seeping into her clothes, into her very bones. A profound physical coldness radiated from the walls, a damp that felt ancient and predatory. She reached out and touched the wall nearest to her. It was slick with a cold, greasy film that clung to her fingers. A violent shiver racked her body. This wasn't just unpleasant. This felt unhealthy. This felt dangerous. Leo coughed, a small, dry sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the cavernous space. Her eyes drifted downwards to the floor. It wasn't concrete, but a surface of rough, uneven flagstones. In the depressions and cracks, shallow pools of murky water stood stagnant, reflecting the pathetic light from the single bulb. She could already imagine the slip and fall hazards, the certainty of Leo getting sick from the constant dampness. Then she looked up. A tangled web of old pipes crisscrossed the low ceiling, disappearing into the darkness. Most were covered in rust and condensation, but from one joint, directly above a growing puddle, a single drop of water was forming. As she watched, it swelled, trembled, and fell. Plink. The sound was small, but in the oppressive silence of the basement, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was followed by another. Plink. A slow, relentless rhythm, a water torture counting down the seconds of their misery. It was the only sound besides their own breathing, a maddening, constant reminder of the decay that surrounded them. There was nothing else. No furniture, no shelves, not even a forgotten crate. Just the vast, empty, weeping space. She and Leo stood just inside the doorway, two small figures dwarfed by the sheer scale of the dereliction. The single bag she had carried with all their worldly possessions looked laughably small and pathetic on the stone floor. Leo, who had been silent until now, tugged on her sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Is this our new house?" He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. The question was a physical blow. It knocked the air from her lungs and shattered the last, microscopic fragment of her composure. She looked from his innocent, trusting face to the mouldy walls, to the dripping pipes, to the dark, stagnant puddles, the hope from the supermarket, the grim determination in the lawyer's office, the weary resolve on the bus. It all evaporated, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. Her heart didn't just sink, it plummeted into a black, bottomless abyss. This wasn't a new beginning, it was a burial. The thin mattress on her former employer's kitchen floor had been a paradise compared to this. At least there, it was dry. At least there, the air was clean. Here, she felt the walls closing in. the weight of the decaying mansion pressing down on her, the damp air trying to suffocate her. A wave of nausea so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. Tears, hot and silent, finally began to stream down her face, mingling with the dampness in the air. She had failed. She had dragged her son from a precarious situation into a tomb. The heavy iron key in her pocket now felt like a stone, dragging her down, down, down into the darkness. She pulled Leo into a fierce hug, burying her face in his hair, trying to shield him from the sight of his mother's complete and utter despair. They had hit rock bottom, and she had a horrifying feeling that the bottom was about to fall out. The only sound was the slow, steady, maddening drip of water, each drop a testament to her failure. Plink, plink, plink. The sheer, overwhelming hopelessness was a physical force, pressing down on her chest and making it hard to breathe. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was inside her now, a deep, internal chill that extinguished the last embers of her fighting spirit. She sank to her knees on the damp, grimy flagstones, pulling Leo down with her, unable to stand under the weight of her crushing defeat. All the running, all the struggling, all the desperate planning had led them here, to a place worse than any she could have imagined. It was a cruel joke. The universe was laughing at her. She felt her body begin to tremble uncontrollably, a combination of the penetrating cold and the shock of her new reality. Her stomach was a tight, painful knot of hunger and fear. The smell of mold was so thick she could taste it on the back of her tongue, a flavor of rot and finality. In her mind, she could hear Mr. Henderson's indifferent voice. "It is not habitable." She had been so desperate she hadn't truly listened. Now the word echoed in the vast, empty chamber, a final judgment on her choices. She held her son tightly, rocking him back and forth, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to comfort him or herself. The weak, yellow light from the single bulb seemed to flicker, making the shadows in the far corners of the room dance and writhe like living things. This place felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by an immense and powerful sorrow. She could feel it in the cold stones, hear it in the groaning of the house above, and smell it in the air she was forced to breathe. It was the accumulated despair of a place left to die, and now she and her son were a part of it. A hot tear fell from her cheek onto Leo's hair. He looked up at her, his expression one of profound concern. He didn't cry. He just watched her, his small hand coming up to touch her wet cheek. That simple, innocent gesture was almost her undoing. It was a reminder of who she was doing this for, and a stark confirmation of how completely she had failed him. There was no escape. They had $25, a bag of clothes, and a key to a dungeon. This was their new home. The first 3 days in the basement were a slow descent into a cold, damp hell. Elena tried to carve out a small island of domesticity in the vast, weeping chamber, placing their single mattress against the driest-looking section of wall, their bag of clothes neatly beside it. But it was a futile gesture. The penetrating chill of the stone floor seeped through the mattress, making sleep a shallow, shivering affair. The air, thick with the cloying, sweet smell of mold, gave her a perpetual headache that throbbed behind her eyes. The only sound was the maddening, rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water dripping from a rusted pipe into a stagnant puddle. It was the sound of decay, the metronome of their despair. Elena felt her spirit, once so resilient, slowly being eroded by the constant dampness and the crushing subterranean silence. She felt buried alive, her every breath a struggle against the heavy, foul air. A profound lethargy settled over her, a feeling that it would be easier to simply lie down on the cold stones and let the darkness take her. For Leo, the confinement was a different kind of torture. The initial fear of the gloomy space had given way to a profound and suffocating boredom. He was a child built for running and sunlight, but here there was only cold stone and weak yellow light. He spent hours tracing patterns in the condensation on the walls or watching the slow, hypnotic drip from the ceiling. Elena's heart ached every time she looked at him. His usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by a quiet listlessness that frightened her more than any tantrum. He spoke in whispers, as if afraid of disturbing the heavy silence of the mansion. The basement was leeching the very life out of him, his pale face a mirror of her own growing despair. To see her son so subdued, so diminished, was a constant, twisting knife in her gut. She felt a fresh wave of self-loathing. She had brought him to this unhealthy, spirit-crushing place. This wasn't a shelter. It was a prison cell, and she was the one who had locked the door. Elena's own body felt like it was breaking down. The gnawing ache in her stomach was a constant companion, a dull fire that the meager portions of crackers and canned soup couldn't extinguish. Her muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary cold that no amount of shivering could shake off. The constant dampness made her joints stiff, and a persistent dry cough had taken root in her chest. She felt herself becoming part of the decay, her own vitality seeping away into the mouldy stones. One afternoon, while Leo was sleeping a fitful, shallow sleep, she sat on the edge of the mattress and simply stared into the gloom, feeling nothing. The fear and panic had burned themselves out, leaving only a hollow, empty numbness. She felt like a ghost, haunting the ruins of her own life. The relentless dripping of the water was the only thing that reminded her that time was still passing. It was in this state of absolute emotional exhaustion that the first hint of a change arrived. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, hollow thud. It was Leo who broke the spell. Waking from his nap, restless and desperate for a distraction, he rediscovered his most prized possession, the small, red rubber ball. In the oppressive silence, he began to bounce it against the flagstone floor. The thump, thump, thump echoed unnervingly in the cavernous space, a small, defiant sound against the tomb-like quiet. At first, Elena was too weary to react. The rhythmic noise was just another layer in the soundscape of their misery, alongside the dripping water and her own shallow breathing. Leo, growing bolder, started tossing the ball against the nearest stone wall. Thump, chack, thump, chack. The sound of the rubber hitting the damp stone was flat and dull. It was the sound of a child trying to reclaim a piece of his childhood in the most desolate place on earth. Elena watched him, her heart a heavy, cold stone in her chest. The simple act of him playing felt like both a miracle and a tragedy. A part of her wanted to tell him to stop, to preserve the crushing silence that matched her mood, but she couldn't bring herself to take this one small joy away from him. Then, one of his throws went slightly wide. The red ball sailed past the section of wall he had been using as a backboard and struck an adjacent area, closer to a dark, mold-infested corner. Instead of the dull thud she had grown used to, the impact produced a strange, hollow thwack. The sound was completely different, shorter and higher pitched, as if the wall in that spot was not as solid. It was a subtle difference, but in the hyper-attentive silence of the basement, it was as loud and startling as a slamming door. Both Elena and Leo froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. A beat of silence passed, broken only by the relentless plink from the ceiling pipe. Then, with a soft, crumbling sigh, a dinner plate-sized chunk of the old, greenish plaster detached from the wall. It seemed to hang in the air for a second before falling to the stone floor, where it disintegrated into a small pile of grey dust with a soft, powdery poof. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before, charged with a new and unknown quality. Leo, his eyes wide, pointed a trembling finger. "Mama," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "Look." Elena's first instinct was a jolt of alarm, a fear that they had damaged the property and would be thrown out onto the street. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through her numb limbs. She scrambled off the mattress, her stiff joints protesting, and rushed over to the wall, her heart pounding with a familiar, sickening dread. "Leo, what did you do?" she started to say, her voice sharp with panic. But the words died in her throat as she saw what the fallen plaster had revealed. Her annoyance evaporated, replaced by a sudden, intense curiosity that was so foreign it felt like a jolt of electricity. For the first time in days, a feeling other than despair pierced through the fog that had enveloped her mind. Her gaze was fixed on the newly exposed patch of stonework, her breath held tight in her chest. Something was not right. Something was different. Most of the wall was constructed of dark, rough-hewn stones of varying shapes and sizes, their surfaces slick with moisture and stained with dark patches of mildew. But in the center of the newly exposed area, one brick stood out in stark contrast. It was a paler grey, almost silvery in the weak light, and its edges were more sharply defined, more rectangular than the irregular stones surrounding it. It was also noticeably cleaner, lacking the centuries of grime and damp that coated its neighbors. It looked new, It didn't belong. It was like finding a freshly minted coin in an ancient tomb. Eleanor felt a strange prickle on the back of her neck, the kind of feeling you get when you realize you are not alone. She knelt on the cold, damp floor, her eyes tracing the outline of the anomalous brick. It was a disruption in the pattern of decay, a small, deliberate anomaly in the chaos of neglect. The sight of it sent a shiver racing down her spine, but this time it had nothing to do with the cold. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched the surface of the strange brick. The stones around it were slick and ice-cold, coated in a greasy film of moisture. But this one felt different. It was cool, yes, but it was also completely dry and had a rough, porous texture, like sandstone. It was as if the relentless dampness of the basement could not touch it. 1,000 impossible thoughts raced through her mind. Why was it here? Why was it different? She pressed her palm flat against it and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift. A gritty movement of stone against mortar. It moved. The brick was loose. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, tired rhythm, suddenly gave a powerful lurch, then began to hammer against her ribs. The air in the basement suddenly felt thick, charged with an electric potential. The mundane misery of her surroundings faded into the background, replaced by a singular, burning question. What was behind this stone? The question became an obsession, a hook that pulled her out of her stupor. She had to know. She clawed at the edges of the brick with her fingernails, but the gap was too small, and the stone was too solid. She needed a tool, something to pry with. Her gaze swept over their pathetic collection of belongings. Clothes, a thin blanket, a half-empty box of crackers. Nothing. A brief flare of excitement began to curdle into frustration. To be so close to something, and to be thwarted by her own poverty felt like the cruelest joke of all. Her mind raced, sifting through an inventory of their possessions with a newfound urgency. Then the image flashed in her mind. Wrapped carefully in a worn dish towel at the bottom of their bag was the one useful thing she'd insisted on bringing from their old apartment. A sturdy, 10-inch kitchen knife with a thick spine, the one she used for cutting tough patterns. It wasn't a crowbar, but it was hardened steel. A wave of renewed determination washed over her, so potent it momentarily eclipsed her hunger and her fear. She retrieved the knife, the familiar weight of its wooden handle a solid, comforting presence in her hand. The steel blade gleamed dully in the weak light. This knife, once a tool for her trade, her art, was now about to become an instrument of discovery. It felt significant, a symbol of her transformation from a passive victim to an active agent in her own story. Leo watched her, his earlier fear replaced by a wide-eyed fascination. He had never seen his mother with such a look of fierce, focused intensity. She returned to the wall and knelt, the cold of the flagstones seeping into her jeans, but she barely noticed. Carefully, she wedged the sharp tip of the knife into the crumbling mortar along the top edge of the loose brick. She held her breath and began to work, levering the handle gently back and forth. A small shower of gritty, grey dust rained down onto her hand. It was working. The mortar was old, brittle, and yielding to the pressure of the steel. The work was slow and arduous. Elena scraped and chipped away at the ancient mortar, her movements economical and precise. The metallic scrape of the knife against the stone was the only sound, a harsh, grating counterpoint to the soft dripping of the water. With each small piece of mortar that fell away, her anticipation grew, becoming a tight knot in her chest. Sweat beaded on her forehead, not from the temperature, but from the exertion and the sheer force of her concentration. She worked with a frantic energy, fueled by a strange mixture of hope and fear. Hope that she might find something, anything, that could change their fate. Fear that she would pry the brick out only to find more solid, damp stone behind it. The thought of such a disappointment was almost unbearable, but the possibility of discovery was a drug, pushing her onward. Her knuckles were scraped raw and bleeding against the surrounding stones, but she didn't feel the sting. All that existed was the brick, the knife and the secret it was guarding. After what felt like an eternity of scraping and prying, she had cleared a significant groove around the entire perimeter of the brick. She put the knife down and pressed her fingers into the gap she had created. This time, when she pulled, the brick wiggled freely in its socket. A thrill, sharp and potent, shot through her. It was time. Taking a deep, ragged breath to steady herself, she gripped the edges of the stone with both hands, braced her feet on the slippery floor, and pulled with all her might. For a second, it resisted, held in place by the suction of a century of damp stillness. Then, with a deep, grating, sucking sound, it came free. The brick was heavier than she expected, and she almost stumbled backward with its weight. She carefully set it down on the floor, her arms trembling from the strain. Her gaze immediately shot back to the wall. It wasn't more stone. It was a hole, a perfect, dark, rectangular void. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She stared into the darkness of the opening, her mind reeling. This was no accident of construction. The cavity was too neat, too deliberate. It was a hiding place, a secret compartment, built into the very foundation of the mansion. The air that drifted out of it was cool, but unlike the rest of the basement, it was dry. It carried a faint, papery scent, the smell of old books and dust, a scent entirely alien to this subterranean world of mildew and rot. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to place a hand against the cold wall to steady herself. This was real. This was happening. Leo crept closer, peering over her shoulder into the dark space. "What is it, Mama?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. She couldn't answer. She couldn't speak. She could only stare into that small rectangle of absolute blackness, her imagination running wild with the possibilities of what it might contain. With a hand that trembled so much she could barely control it, Eleanor reached into the cold, dark void. Her fingers brushed against something stiff and slightly waxy. Not stone, not dirt, fabric. She gripped the edge of it and pulled. A small, neat bundle, wrapped in what looked like dark, waterproof oilcloth, slid out of the compartment and into her waiting hands. It was surprisingly heavy, dense with a weight that spoke of substance. She carried it back to their mattress, back to their tiny island of relative safety, as if she were carrying a newborn child. She sat down, her legs suddenly weak, and placed the mysterious package in her lap. The oilcloth was cool to the touch and stiff with age, but it had done its job perfectly. The bundle was completely dry, a small miracle in this weeping crypt. The twine that bound it was old and brittle, and it snapped with a simple tug. Her fingers fumbled as she began to unwrap the protective cloth, her heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm in her ears. The final layer of oilcloth fell away, revealing the contents. Eleanor gasped. A sharp intake of breath that was loud in the silence. Lying on the dark fabric was a small stack of letters, no more than 20 or 30 of them, tied together with a faded silk ribbon that had once been blue. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges soft and fragile-looking. The ink on the topmost envelope was written in an elegant looping script, the address faded but still legible, and nestled beside the letters, almost hidden, was a small book, no bigger than her hand. It was bound in dark, supple leather, now cracked and worn at the spine. A small tarnished brass clasp, green with verdigris, held it shut. It was a diary. The air seemed to thrum with the weight of the discovery. These were not just objects. They were voices from the past. They were secrets. The dry, dusty scent of old paper rose from the bundle, a perfume of history that filled her lungs and made her head spin. She picked up the topmost letter, her fingers barely daring to touch the fragile paper. It felt weightless, ethereal, a ghost of a thing. The elegant handwriting was that of a man named Arthur Caldwell, the name a faint echo from her conversation with the lawyer. These were his letters. This was his diary. A shiver of profound connection rippled through her. She was holding a piece of a man's life, his private thoughts, hidden away from the world for what must have been decades. Why? Why would a man hide his personal correspondence and diary inside a wall in the basement of his own home? The question hung in the air, a tantalizing mystery. The desperation and misery that had been her constant companions for days receded, pushed back by an overwhelming wave of curiosity and a dawning, terrifying sliver of hope. She felt a fundamental shift in her reality, as if the world had tilted on its axis. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was now the keeper of a secret. The leather-bound diary was cool and smooth in her hand. The little brass clasp was stiff, frozen shut by time. She worked it gently with her thumbnail, trying to coax it open without breaking it. The thought of what might be written inside made her whole body tremble with anticipation. Confessions, secrets, an explanation for this grand, decaying house and the sorrow that seemed to cling to its very stones. This was more than just a lucky find. It felt like destiny, a breadcrumb trail left by a ghost. She had been led to this place, to this wall, to this very spot. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. She felt a sudden, crushing sense of responsibility. These were not her stories to read, but they had fallen into her hands, the hands of a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. What was written on these yellowed pages and within this locked book could change everything, or it could be nothing at all. The uncertainty was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest, a buzzing in her ears. She looked at Leo, who was sitting beside her, his eyes fixed on the bundle. He didn't understand the significance of the find, but he understood the shift in her. He could feel the new energy radiating from her, a stark contrast to the hollowed-out despair of the past few days. For the first time since they had arrived, a genuine, hopeful smile touched Elena's lips. It felt foreign on her face, like a muscle she hadn't used in a very long time. She ran a hand through his hair, her touch now full of a new, tentative promise. "I think," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I think things might be about to change." She didn't know how or why. She didn't know if the change would be for better or for worse, but the stagnation had been broken. A mystery had presented itself, a puzzle dropped into her lap, and as she looked from the ancient letters to the small, locked diary, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not rest until she had uncovered the truth hidden within them. The musty scent of the old papers was a stark contrast to the damp, cloying smell of mold that permeated the basement. It was the scent of dry attics, of libraries, of time locked away in a box. Elena held the small bundle in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the yellowed envelopes. A profound sense of trespassing warred with an insatiable curiosity. These were Mr. Arthur Caldwell's private thoughts, his correspondence, his life, sealed away from the world. What right did she have to intrude upon his secrets? But then, the cold of the stone floor seeped through her jeans, a grim reminder of her own desperate situation. She and her son were living in the man's decaying foundation, fighting for survival. Perhaps that gave her the right. Perhaps finding this was not an accident, but a charge, a responsibility passed down through time to the next soul desperate enough to inhabit this sorrowful place. The weight of this possibility settled on her shoulders, heavy and real. With a sense of crossing a point of no return, she carefully untied the faded silk ribbon holding the bundle of letters together. It felt like an act of desecration. The ribbon, once likely a vibrant blue, was now the color of a cloudy sky, and it felt impossibly fragile between her rough fingers. As it came loose and the small stack of letters seemed to breathe, to relax after decades of tight confinement. She selected one from the middle of the pile, the paper so brittle she was afraid it might crumble to dust in her hands. The envelope was addressed in the same elegant, looping script to a woman named Eleonora, a name so close to her own it sent a strange jolt through her. She carefully slid a finger under the flap, which was already loose, and extracted the single folded sheet from within. The paper was thin, almost translucent in the weak light, and covered in dense, spidery handwriting. She had to hold it close to her face to even attempt to read it. The brass clasp on the diary was stubborn. It was a tiny, intricate lock, and time had fused it shut. Elena examined it closely, her brow furrowed in concentration. She saw a minuscule keyhole, no bigger than the head of a pin. There was no key. A wave of frustration washed over her. The real story, the context for the letters, was likely locked within this little book, and she had no way to access it. She was about to set it aside in defeat when she thought of the knife again. It was a crude tool for such a delicate task, but it was all she had. With the utmost care, she inserted the very tip of the blade into the tiny gap between the clasp and the cover. She wiggled it gently, applying the slightest pressure. She felt a faint click, a tiny release of tension. The clasp sprang open with a soft metallic ping that echoed in the vast, silent room. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The diary was open. The secrets were hers for the taking. Before she dared to open the book, she took one last look around the vast, gloomy chamber, the dripping water, the spreading mold, the oppressive shadows. It was all still there. The basement hadn't changed, but she had. The heavy cloak of despair had been lifted, replaced by a thrilling, terrifying sense of purpose. This discovery was a light in the darkness, a single point of focus in the chaos of her life. It was a story waiting to be told, and for reasons she couldn't comprehend, she had been chosen to hear it. She looked at her son, who had picked up his red ball again, but was now just holding it, watching her with rapt attention. He was the reason she had to do this. He was the reason she had to find out what these papers meant. If there was even the slimmest chance that the contents of this bundle could lead them out of this tomb, she had to take it. She had to read them. She had to know. Her hands trembled as she opened the small leather diary to its first page. The paper inside was of high quality, creamy and thick, and had resisted the yellowing that had claimed the letters. The first entry was dated in a neat, precise hand, October 12, 1968. The ink was a dark, faded blue. The script was the same as on the letters, but somehow more personal, less guarded. The first line she read made a cold dread bloom in her chest, instantly chasing away the thrill of discovery. It read, "The deal is done. God forgive me for what we are about to do to these people." A powerful shiver racked her entire body, a cold that had nothing to do with the damp air. This wasn't a love story. This wasn't a simple history. This was a confession. The dry, dusty smell of the paper suddenly seemed more menacing, like the scent of old bones. She had not just stumbled upon a secret, she had stumbled upon a crime. She quickly leafed through a few of the letters. They were written to the mysterious Eleonora, and they were filled with anguish and regret. Fragments of sentences leaped out at her, each one a piece of a horrifying puzzle. Their homes burned in the night. The sheriff's men, acting like thugs. Falsified deeds, a stroke of a pen to steal a generation of work. Their faces haunt my every waking moment. Elena's heart pounded with a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. She felt sick to her stomach. This wasn't a treasure chest of gold or jewels she had found. It was something far more potent and far more dangerous. It was evidence. She was holding the written proof of a terrible injustice, a story of violence and theft that had been deliberately buried in the foundation of the very house she was in. The walls of the basement no longer felt just old and decayed. They felt complicit, their weeping stones shedding tears for a crime they had witnessed. Elena snapped the diary shut, her hands shaking. The small book suddenly felt immensely heavy, burning with the heat of its terrible secrets. The initial excitement was gone, replaced by a cold, visceral fear. This was not a lifeline. This was a burden, a dangerous one. Who was Arthur Caldwell? Who was his partner, the sheriff? And who were the people they had forced from this land? The questions swirled in her mind, creating a vortex of fear and confusion. Keeping this secret felt impossible, but revealing it felt terrifying. She was a nobody, a transient with $25 to her name. What could she possibly do with this information? Who would ever believe her? The discovery had not solved her problems. It had multiplied them exponentially. She was no longer just fighting poverty and homelessness. She was now tangled in a dark history, a ghost story that was threatening to become terrifyingly real. The single, weak bulb above her seemed to flicker, and for a moment she felt like she was being watched by the ghosts of the past. With a trembling hand, Elena traced the faded blue ink of the first diary entry. The words were not a narrative. They were a raw, bleeding wound on the page. Arthur Caldwell's elegant script detailed a dark bargain struck with a man he named only as Sheriff Davies, a pact sealed with whiskey and greed. Elena felt the cold of the stone floor seep into her bones, a chill that seemed to emanate from the pages themselves. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of dawning horror. This was no dusty relic of the past. It was a living, breathing crime. The scent of old paper filled her nostrils, no longer a smell of history, but of secrets and rot. The words described a plan to seize a plot of land, a thriving community of sharecroppers, whose only crime was living on soil that powerful men coveted. Elena felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She was not an observer. She was an excavator, and she had just unearthed a tomb. The basement's gloom suddenly felt heavier, thicker, as if the weight of Caldwell's confession had been added to the air. She continued to read, her eyes flying across the page. absorbing the terrible story piece by agonizing piece. Caldwell's diary was a meticulous catalogue of guilt. He wrote of his partner, Sheriff Davies, a man with a chilling laugh and eyes like chips of flint. Davies was the architect of the scheme, the brute force behind Caldwell's legal chicanery. They planned it over maps spread on polished tables, far from the lives they were about to destroy. The diary spoke of the community, the Freemen's Hope, a collective of African-American families who had worked the land for 2 generations, turning it from fallow fields into a prosperous enclave. Caldwell wrote their names down: the Abernathys, the Youngs, the Dubois family. Elena mouthed the names silently, and they felt like ghosts on her tongue. The cold, calculated nature of the plot made her blood run cold. It was a conspiracy of 2 men, one with a badge and one with a pen, to erase an entire community for profit. The diary was the ledger of their sin. A single letter, its paper as thin as a moth's wing, described the night the plan was executed. It was not written by Caldwell, but addressed to him, a frantic, unsigned note from someone else involved. It spoke of fire. The flames licked the night sky. The spidery script read, "We told them it was a wildfire, a tragic accident." Elena's breath hitched in her throat. She could almost smell the smoke, hear the crackle of burning wood, and the phantom screams carried on the wind. The letter detailed how Sheriff Davies and his deputies, their faces hidden by darkness and their own grim purpose, had descended on the community with torches and threats, driving families from their beds and into the night, with only the clothes on their backs. Elena felt her own body go rigid with sympathetic terror. She pulled Leo closer, who was dozing beside her, and held him tight, her protective instinct flaring like a physical fire in her chest. The weight of this history was suffocating, the violence of it so palpable it felt like it had happened only yesterday. Deeper in the diary, Caldwell laid out the legal mechanism of the theft. It was sickeningly simple. With the families scattered and terrified, presumed by the wider world to be victims of a natural disaster, Sheriff Davies had declared the properties abandoned. Caldwell, a lawyer with more ambition than morals, then stepped in. He used his expertise to falsify deeds, backdate documents, and file claims that erased the community's legal ownership as if it had never existed. "A stroke of the pen," Caldwell wrote. "I to steal a generation of work. I murdered them on paper." He described how the sprawling tract of land was then officially granted to a shell corporation he and Davies controlled. They had built this very mansion on the ashes of those stolen homes, a monument to their crime. Elena felt a profound sickness settle in her stomach. She was living in the foundation of a stolen dream, sheltered by walls built on lies and watered with the tears of displaced people. The constant dripping from the pipes suddenly sounded like weeping. In the final entries, Caldwell's despair was a tangible thing. His wealth and the grand mansion had brought him no peace, only a deepening, soul-crushing guilt. "Eleonora has left me," one entry read. "She could not live in this house of ghosts, and I cannot blame her." The letters, she now understood, were his unsent pleas for forgiveness to the woman who saw the truth. He wrote of being haunted by the faces of the families he'd helped displace, of hearing their children crying in the night. He confessed that he lacked the courage to expose the truth while he lived, terrified of his ruthless partner. And so, he created this time capsule. He sealed the proof, the letters, the diary, the list of names, behind the brick, lining the compartment with oilcloth to protect it from the damp rot of his decaying home. "Let this be a map for a future justice," he wrote on the last page. "Let this truth not die with me." Eleanor closed the diary, her hands trembling. She was now the holder of that map. Just as the full weight of this revelation settled upon her, a sound sliced through the basement's oppressive silence. It was a low rumble, a purr of a powerful engine, completely alien to the quiet desolation of the estate. It grew louder, closer. The sound of an expensive car navigating the overgrown gravel road. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through Elena, sharp and electric. Her mind screamed, "Someone is here." Her first instinct was primal. She scrambled to gather the letters and the diary, her fingers clumsy with panic. She stuffed the bundle back into the oilcloth, her heart pounding a deafening tattoo against her ribs. She shoved the package deep into the hollow space in the wall and frantically tried to fit the loose brick back into place. It wouldn't sit right. It was crooked. The engine outside cut off. plunging the world back into a sudden, terrifying silence. Then she heard it. The crunch of expensive leather shoes on gravel and the heavy, confident footsteps approaching the basement door. A sharp, authoritative rap echoed from the other side of the heavy wooden door. 3 knocks. Loud, impatient. "Hello?" a voice called out, smooth and deep, laced with an unmistakable tone of command. It was not the reedy, indifferent voice of the lawyer. This was different. This was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Elena froze, her body rigid with fear. Her hand was still on the crooked brick in the wall. She felt utterly exposed, a cornered animal. Leo, awakened by the noise, let out a small, frightened whimper and scrambled behind her, clutching the back of her shirt. "I know someone's in there," the voice continued, a hint of steel now underlying the smooth tone. "The lawyer informed me. Open the door." The words were not a request. They were an order. Elena's throat went dry. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of fear and frantic calculation. To not answer might be worse. With trembling legs, she stood and walked to the door, her every step an act of will. She pulled the heavy door open just enough to peer out. The man standing there seemed to suck all the light from the grey afternoon. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that must have cost more than she had earned in a year. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his face was handsome in a severe, predatory way. He radiated an aura of wealth, power, and absolute confidence. His eyes, a pale and chilling blue, scanned the squalor of her basement dwelling with a flicker of open disgust before landing on her. A faint, expensive scent of cologne drifted in, a smell of cedar and citrus that was a shocking violation of the basement's atmosphere of mold and decay. "My apologies for the intrusion," he said, his lips curling into a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "I'm Jameson Davies. My friends call me J.D. I'm in the process of acquiring this property." He extended a hand, not to shake hers, but as a gesture of magnanimous introduction. The name hit Elena like a physical blow. Davies, the son of the corrupt sheriff. The blood in her veins turned to ice. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to grip the edge of the door to keep from falling. It was him, the heir to the crime. The reason Caldwell had hidden the confession. He was here. He knew. He must have known there was a chance that evidence of his father's sins was hidden somewhere on the property. That's why he was so determined to get it. He was not just acquiring land. He was burying a history. He was trying to finish the job his father had started. Elena stared at him, her face a pale, frozen mask. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Her mind was a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. The ghost story had just walked up to her door, dressed in a $1,000 suit and smelling of expensive cologne. He was real, and he was infinitely more terrifying than any phantom. He seemed to take her stunned silence as a sign of intimidated compliance. His smile widened, becoming even more predatory. "I understand you're the new caretaker," he said, the word dripping with condescension. He glanced past her at Leo, who was peeking out from behind her legs. "Look, I'll be frank. This place is not fit for human habitation, much less for a child. It's a matter of time before the county condemns it. And then, where will you be?" He spoke with a practiced, reasonable tone, the kind a politician uses to mask a threat as a concern. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick roll of bills held together by a gold money clip. The gesture was casual, designed to overwhelm. He peeled off a thick stack of $100 bills. "Guys, I want you gone," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "But I'm a compassionate man. I'm prepared to offer you $1,000 to help you relocate, find a decent place for you and your boy." The sight of the money made Elena's head spin. $1,000. It was a fortune. It was more money than she had seen in one place in her entire life. It was a bus ticket to anywhere. It was a deposit on a real apartment. It was food, clothes, a new start. It was an escape from this cold, damp tomb. For a dizzying second, all she felt was a profound, desperate temptation. Take it. Take the money and run. Forget the letters. Forget the diary. Forget the ghosts. Survive. It was a devil's bargain, offered by the devil himself. Her hand twitched, a traitorous muscle wanting to reach out and snatch the salvation he was offering. But then she saw the look in his eyes. It was a cold, calculating assessment. He wasn't offering her a lifeline, he was buying her silence. He was trying to purchase the secret she now held, a secret he clearly suspected but had not yet found. He was cleaning up a loose end, and she and her son were it. Her hesitation was a tangible thing in the air between them. She didn't move, she didn't speak, she just stood there, her heart warring with her head. The $1,000 a burning temptation just inches from her grasp. J.D. Davies's smile finally faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. The mask of the compassionate benefactor slipped, revealing the cold ruthlessness underneath. His gaze, sharp and dangerous, shifted from her face down to her son. Leo, sensing the change in atmosphere, shrank further behind her leg. Davies's eyes narrowed, and he took a small, deliberate step closer. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a sudden, palpable menace. He was no longer trying to persuade her. He was preparing to intimidate her. Elena felt a surge of pure, primal fear, not for herself, but for her child. Her body tensed, every muscle screaming at her to slam the door, to run, to do anything to get her son away from this man. His voice, in when he spoke again, was a low, menacing purr, stripped of all its earlier pleasantries. It was a sound that sent a shard of ice straight into Elena's heart. He kept his eyes fixed on Leo, a deliberate act of psychological warfare. "It's a beautiful part of the country out here," he said softly, the words hanging in the damp air like poison gas, "but very isolated." He paused, letting the weight of that word sink in. Isolated. No neighbors, no one to hear you scream, no witnesses. Eleanor felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel Leo trembling behind her. The man's gaze was a physical touch, a violation that made her skin crawl. He was showing her exactly what he was capable of, what his power could do in a place like this, a place where people could simply disappear without a trace. This was the same cold-blooded cruelty that Caldwell had described in his diary. It had been passed from father to son. Then, he delivered the final, devastating blow. He finally lifted his cold blue eyes to meet hers, a flicker of cruel amusement in their depths. "Accidents happen," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet each word struck her with the force of a physical impact. He let his gaze drift back to her son, who was now crying silently, his small face buried in Elena's leg. "Especially," Davies added, drawing out the word with chilling deliberation, "with curious children." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a naked, brutal promise. A promise of what would happen if she stayed. What would happen if she got in his way? What would happen if she or her curious son found something they weren't supposed to find? In that moment, Elena felt a terror so profound, so absolute, that it almost stopped her heart. It was the primal fear of a mother seeing a predator circling her young. He wasn't just threatening her, he was threatening the one thing in the universe she could not bear to lose. He tossed the roll of bills onto the dusty stone ledge just inside the doorway. The sound of the money hitting the stone was obscenely loud in the sudden silence. 24 hours, he said, his voice once again crisp and businesslike. He didn't wait for a response. He turned, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, and walked back to his car. The door slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and a moment later, the sound of the car faded into the distance, leaving behind only the dripping water, the smell of mold, and the lingering alien scent of his cologne. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She stared at the $1,000, a small pile of paper that represented an impossible choice. He was offering her a way out, but at the cost of justice, at the cost of the truth she now held in her hands. To stay meant facing a man who would clearly do anything to protect his family's dark secret. The lives of her and her son were now forfeit. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money and run, ensuring your child's safety, but letting a terrible crime remain buried forever? Or would you risk everything for a justice you may never live to see? The silence that swallowed the roar of J.D. Davies's car was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise itself. It was a suffocating, predatory silence, thick with unspoken threats and the lingering, nauseatingly sweet scent of his cologne. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her body racked with tremors she couldn't control. A deep, bone-chilling cold, far colder than the basement's perpetual damp. radiated from the pit of her stomach, spreading through her limbs and turning her blood to ice. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with a frantic rhythm, but with slow, heavy thuds of pure terror, each beat a painful reminder of the choice she now faced. The image of Davies's cold blue eyes as he looked at her son was burned into her mind, a permanent scar. The whispered words, "Accidents happen," echoed endlessly in the cavernous room, stripping the air from her lungs. She felt a wave of dizziness so intense she had to grip the rough stone of the doorframe, her knuckles white, just to remain standing. The world had shrunk to this single, horrifying moment. The $1,000 lay on the dusty stone ledge, a neat stack of bills that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy in the dim light. It was a king's ransom. It was escape. It was a warm bed, a full stomach for Leo, a life far away from the grasping claws of Jameson Davies. The temptation was a physical thing, a siren song calling to the deepest, most desperate part of her. Her mind screamed at her to take it, to snatch the money and run without looking back, forget the ghosts, forget the injustice, survive. That was a mother's first and only duty, but as she stared at the money, she didn't see deliverance. She saw a bribe. She saw hush money. She saw the price of her silence, the cost of letting a monstrous crime remain buried forever. Taking that money would not only make her complicit, it would be a betrayal of Arthur Caldwell's final, desperate act of conscience. More than that, it would be a betrayal of the families whose names she now knew, the Abernathys and the Youngs, whose lives had been shattered on this very soil. Her gaze drifted to Leo, who was still clinging to her leg, his small body trembling. His face was buried in the fabric of her jeans, his silent tears soaking the cloth, and in that instant, the choice became terrifyingly clear. Davies had not threatened her. He had threatened her son. He had used the most precious thing in her universe as a weapon against her, and that was a line that could never be uncrossed. A surge of pure, primal rage, hot and cleansing, burned through the icy fog of her fear. It was the fury of a mother bear whose cub has been menaced by a predator. This was no longer just about a historical injustice or a hidden secret. It was personal. Davies had made it personal. The $1,000 on the ledge was no longer a temptation. It was an insult. It was a symbol of his arrogance, of his belief that everything and everyone had a price. He had misjudged her. He had mistaken her desperation for weakness, and he had underestimated the ferocious, unyielding power of her love for her child. She stepped back from the doorway, pulling Leo with her, and let the heavy basement door swing shut. It closed with a deep, groaning thud that echoed like a clap of thunder, sealing them back inside the tomb. The finality of the sound was strangely comforting. She had made her choice. She would not run with his money. She would not be bought. But the rage that had momentarily fortified her began to cool, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of her situation. He had given her 24 hours. Davies was not a man who made idle threats. He would be back. And when he returned, he would not be carrying a stack of cash. The basement, once a symbol of her rock bottom, now felt like a trap, a cage with the tiger circling just outside. The dripping water, the spreading mold, the oppressive shadows, they were all closing in on her, suffocating her. She felt a familiar knot of nausea tighten in her throat. She had defied him, but she was still utterly, terrifyingly trapped with her son in the foundation of his stolen empire. Her mind raced, sifting through impossible options. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go to the police. What would she say? That a powerful local politician had offered her money and made a veiled threat. They would laugh her out of the station. She was a homeless woman living in a condemned basement. He was J.D. Davies. She had no credibility, no power. All she had was a bundle of old papers hidden behind a loose brick. Proof. But proof was useless if she and her son were silenced before she could ever use it. Panic began to claw at her again, a frantic scrambling in her chest. She had to get out. She had to get Leo somewhere safe. But where? The world outside this decaying property was vast and indifferent. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her. Mrs. Gable's kitchen floor was no longer an option. They were completely and utterly alone. Or were they? A fragment of information from the bus ride surfaced in her memory. The only neighboring house, a simple cottage. Through a grimy, cobweb-covered sliver of a window high on the far wall, she could see a tiny pinprick of light. It was weak, almost lost in the grey gloom of the late afternoon. But it was there, a light in a window. It meant people. It meant a neighbour. Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in her chest. The lawyer had called the mansion isolated, not deserted. A simple cottage. It was a long shot, a gamble of monumental proportions. Knocking on a stranger's door, a wild-eyed, terrified woman clutching a small boy, babbling about conspiracies and threats. They could slam the door in her face. They could call the police, or worse, they could be allied with Davies, another pair of eyes watching the property for him. The risk was immense, but the risk of staying put was a certainty. It was the certainty of Davies returning. It was the certainty of a terrible accident. The pinprick of light was the only chance she had, a tiny, flickering candle in an ocean of darkness. She had to take it. With her decision made, a new kind of energy surged through her, an energy born of pure, unadulterated desperation. She moved with frantic purpose. First, she retrieved the bundle of evidence from its hiding place, her fingers trembling as she touched the oilcloth. The weight of the letters and the diary felt immense, a tangible burden of proof. She couldn't carry it openly. She unzipped their single, worn bag of clothes and carefully buried the oilcloth-wrapped bundle at the very bottom, beneath layers of worn shirts and Leo's small sweaters. It was a pathetic hiding place, but it was the best she could do. She then took the $1,000 from the ledge. The bills felt greasy, tainted. She wouldn't use them for escape, but she couldn't leave them for him either. She stuffed the thick wad of cash deep into her pocket. It felt like a stone, a weight against her leg. She took Leo by the hand, his small fingers cold and trembling, and looked into his frightened eyes. "We're going to go for a walk, sweetie," she whispered, her voice strained. Leaving the basement felt like emerging from a grave. The cool, damp air outside was a shock, smelling of pine needles and wet earth, a welcome antidote to the suffocating stench of mold. She didn't dare use the overgrown gravel road. Instead, she circled around the back of the hulking mansion, keeping to the shadows of the crumbling structure. The woods that bordered the property were dense and dark, a tangled wall of ancient trees and thick undergrowth. Somewhere through those woods was the cottage. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart in her ears, a drum of terror and adrenaline. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like footsteps. She clutched Leo's hand so tightly her knuckles were white, her eyes scanning the dark woods, half expecting Davies or his men to emerge from the trees at any moment. The feeling of being watched was a physical presence, a prickling on the back of her neck that made her want to run screaming into the night. After a few minutes of tense, frantic searching, she saw it. Through a break in the trees, she could see the faint outline of a small house nestled in a clearing. A thin ribbon of grey smoke curled from a stone chimney, a comforting sign of life. It was a simple cottage, just as the bus driver had said, with a steeply pitched roof and dark, weathered shingles. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, a stark contrast to the Gothic horror of the Caldwell mansion. A warm yellow light glowed from a single window, a beacon of impossible hope. As she drew closer, she could smell the rich, comforting scent of burning wood, and something else, something savory, like roasting meat or a hearty stew. The homey smells were so alien to her recent experience, they almost made her weep. She stepped out of the woods and onto the edge of a neatly kept lawn, the single bag bumping against her leg. Her son, a small, shivering shadow at her side. She had made it. Now came the hardest part, asking for help. She approached the solid wooden door, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. She could hear the faint, steady ticking of a clock from inside, a sound of peaceful domesticity that felt a world away. For a moment, her courage failed her. She was a wreck, her clothes damp and dirty, her hair a mess, her face pale with terror. Who would ever open their door to such a spectacle? But then she thought of Leo, and her resolve hardened. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound was softer than she intended, a timid, desperate tap. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. Silence. She knocked again, louder this time, more insistent. Footsteps shuffled from within, slow and heavy. A bolt scraped back with a loud, metallic clank. The door creaked open a few inches, and a sliver of a face, deeply wrinkled and framed by a shock of white hair, peered out. A pair of dark, intelligent eyes, cloudy with age but sharp and alert, surveyed her from head to toe, taking in her disheveled state and the terrified child clinging to her leg. The man who opened the door was ancient, his body stooped and frail, but his gaze was unwavering. He must have been at least 80, his skin a roadmap of a long and difficult life. He wore a simple flannel shirt and dark trousers held up by suspenders. The air that wafted out of the house was warm and smelled of pipe tobacco, old books, and chicken soup. It was the smell of a grandfather's house. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, surprisingly strong for a man his age. He wasn't hostile, but his tone was cautious, reserved. Elena's own voice was a reedy whisper when she finally found it. I'm sorry to bother you," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "My name is Elena. This is my son Leo. We're staying in the basement of the big house. We're in trouble. Terrible trouble." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something she couldn't quite read. Recognition, perhaps, or just profound weariness. He looked from her face to Leo's, and a long moment of silence stretched between them. She knew she had to convince him, and fast. Words were failing her. Acting on a desperate impulse, she fumbled with the zipper on her bag, her fingers clumsy with haste. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I can't explain it all, but you have to believe me. A man came. His name is Davies." At the mention of the name, the old man's body went rigid. A flash of something dark and ancient, a memory of pain, crossed his face. Elena didn't wait for him to process it. She pulled the oilcloth bundle from her bag. Her hands shook so violently she could barely untie the twine. She grabbed one of the letters at random, the one addressed to Eleonora, its paper fragile and soft as cloth. "I found this," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, holding out the yellowed envelope. "Inside the wall it talks about what happened here, about what they did." The old man stared at the letter in her hand, his gaze fixed on the elegant, looping script of Arthur Caldwell's name. His breath hitched, a small, sharp sound in the quiet evening air. He reached out a gnarled, trembling hand, his fingers scarred and calloused from a lifetime of labor. He didn't take the letter. Instead, his finger traced the name Caldwell on the envelope, a gesture of profound and sorrowful familiarity. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of the pain in his eyes. It was a grief that was decades old, a wound that had never healed. "Arthur Caldwell," he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips. "I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in 50 years. He then looked past her, his gaze fixed on the dark, hulking silhouette of the mansion, visible through the trees. "And Davies," he added, his voice hardening, turning to gravel and flint. "Now that is a name I have tried to forget every single day of my life." He finally pulled his gaze back to her, and his eyes were no longer just weary. They were filled with a terrible, dawning understanding. He knew. He had always known. Without another word, he opened the door wider. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice urgent. "Both of you, now." He led them into a small, cluttered living room. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow on walls lined with overflowing bookshelves. The air was thick with the comforting scents she had noticed at the door. An old, brindle-colored dog with a graying muzzle lifted its head from a rug by the fire, thumped its tail twice, and then laid its head back down. The old man gestured for them to sit on a worn floral sofa. He introduced himself as Mr. Joseph. Elena sank into the soft cushions, a profound wave of relief washing over her, so potent it left her weak and trembling. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of safety. Leo, sensing the change, finally let go of her leg and stared, mesmerized, at the dancing flames in the fireplace. Mr. Joseph settled into a large armchair opposite them, the springs groaning under his weight. He picked up the letter she still clutched in her hand and held it carefully, as if it were a sacred relic. He didn't read it. He just stared at the names. "The Freeman's Hope," he said softly. The words hung in the air, a name full of promise and tragedy. "The diary calls it that," Eleanor whispered, her voice full of awe. "The community. He lists the names of the families." Mr. Joseph closed his eyes, a pained expression on his face. "The Abernathys," he recited, his voice a low, mournful chant. My mother's cousins. Old man Abernathy could grow anything on that land. Sweetest peaches you ever tasted. He opened his eyes, and they were glistening with unshed tears. The Youngs. William Young was my best friend. We learned to swim in that creek together. He pointed a trembling finger at the letter. The Dubois family. That was us. I was Joseph Dubois before we had to change everything, before we had to run. The confession was a physical blow. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This wasn't just a neighbor. This wasn't just a witness. He was one of them. He was a survivor. The final living piece of the puzzle she had unearthed. He was the keeper of the history, the guardian of the truth. He began to speak, and the past came flooding into the small, warm room. He was a teenager, he explained, just 15 years old on the night it all happened. His voice was low and steady, but Elena could hear the tremor of a 50-year-old trauma just beneath the surface. He described the Freemen's Hope not as a shanty town, but as a vibrant, proud community. He spoke of church picnics and shared harvests, of the smell of his mother's baking and the sound of men singing as they worked the fields. He painted a picture of a life that was hard but good, a life built on sweat, faith, and the rich soil they had nurtured for generations. He made her see it, feel it, understand exactly what had been lost, what had been stolen. He wasn't just telling a story, he was bearing witness, resurrecting a world that Davies and Caldwell had tried to burn and bury. Elena listened, captivated, her own troubles momentarily forgotten, replaced by the sheer weight of this man's history. The fire crackled, a stark contrast to the inferno he was describing from his memory. Then his voice grew dark. He spoke of the new sheriff, a man named Davies, who arrived with a cold smile and a palpable aura of menace. He described the escalating intimidation, deputies patrolling their roads for no reason, trumped-up fines for minor infractions, a slow, methodical campaign of harassment designed to wear them down. He remembered the night of the fire, the memory as sharp and clear as if it were yesterday. He spoke of being woken not by smoke, but by the sound of shouting and the terrified barking of dogs. He described peering out his window and seeing dark figures with torches moving through the trees, their silhouettes stark against the orange glow of the first building they set ablaze, the community hall. He recalled the sickening, sweet smell of kerosene in the air. It wasn't a wildfire. It was a planned, deliberate assault. It was a pogrom. The blood drained from Elena's face as she listened, her stomach churning with a mixture of horror and fury. He described the chaos, the terror. Sheriff Davies, his face illuminated by the flames of the burning hall, a monstrous silhouette with a shotgun cradled in his arms. He wasn't directing a rescue, he was commanding an invasion. He told us a fire had broken out and we had to evacuate, Mr. Joseph said, his voice thick with a lifetime of repressed rage. But his men weren't helping us. They were herding us, pushing us toward the main road, not letting anyone go back for their belongings, for their savings, for their deeds. He remembered his father arguing, trying to reason with Davies, and the sheriff just laughed, his laugh a cold, dead sound in the hot night. He saw Davies bring the butt of his shotgun down hard on William Young's father when he tried to run back to his house, the sickening crunch of bone, the sight of the man falling to the ground. That was the moment the hope died. That was the moment they knew they were not just being evicted, they were being erased, violently and without mercy. The air in the room was thick with the horror of it. Mr. Joseph fell silent, his story finished. He stared into the fire, his mind 50 years in the past. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock and Leo's soft, even breathing as he slept on the sofa, exhausted by the day's terror. The old man finally looked at Elena, his eyes clear and hard as diamonds. His son Jameson is worse than the father, he stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. The father was a brute, but the son is a snake. He spent his entire life burying what his father did, buying politicians, silencing anyone who knew the truth. He's been trying to get his hands on that mansion for years, terrified something like what you found was hidden inside. He nodded toward the diary and letters, which now lay on the coffee table between them. That right there, he said, his voice a grim whisper, is a death warrant. He knows you have it, or he suspects you do. He will not let you leave this place alive with it. The words, spoken with such calm certainty, chilled Elena to her very soul. A new, more immediate terror seized her. This wasn't just about a past crime anymore. The threat was present, active. Davies was not a ghost. He was a very real monster who was now hunting her. She looked at the sleeping form of her son, his face so peaceful and innocent, and a wave of protective fury washed over her. Mr. Joseph was right. She couldn't stay. She couldn't hide. Davies would be back, and he would tear the basement apart until he found what he was looking for, and then he would eliminate the only person who knew it existed. Her. "What do I do?" she whispered. The question a desperate plea. "Where can I go?" Mr. Joseph leaned forward, his old eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce intensity. "There is no where right now," he said firmly. "There is only a way. You have to get away from this land. Tonight. Now you have to get that evidence to someone who can use it against him, someone he can't buy or intimidate." Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered within her. He wasn't just telling her the problem. He was trying to find a solution. The old man stood up, his frail body moving with a surprising agility. "My nephew is a paralegal," he said, his mind clearly working fast. "He works for a big civil rights organization in the city. They eat men like J.D. Davies for breakfast. But you have to get to them. I'll call him. We'll arrange a meeting. But first, you have to disappear." He went to a roll-top desk in the corner and began rummaging through it. "They'll be back," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Davies won't wait the full 24 hours. He can't risk it. He'll send his thugs tonight to find and burn any old papers." The phrase, a direct echo of her own fears, sent another shiver of dread down her spine. Mr. Joseph knew his enemy. He understood the ruthless, predictable logic of the man who had destroyed his childhood. He returned with a small, sturdy canvas bag. "Put the papers in here," he instructed. "We can't risk him finding them on you if the worst happens." The unspoken possibility hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor carefully placed the oilcloth-wrapped bundle into the canvas bag. Mr. Joseph took it and disappeared into a back room. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, each second stretching into an eternity. Every creak of the old house made her jump. She woke Leo gently, whispering that it was time to go. The boy was groggy and confused, his eyes wide with sleepy fear. Mr. Joseph returned, now wearing a thick jacket and holding a heavy, powerful flashlight. "They'll come by the road," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's the only way a car can get in. They won't expect anyone to go through the woods at night." "Not these woods." He looked at her, his expression grim. "I was born on this land. I played in these woods my entire childhood. I know them better than Jameson Davies knows his own manicured lawn. I can get you to the old logging trail on the other side. From there, it's a 5-mile walk to the next town." The plan was terrifying, but it was a plan. It was a path forward. It was a chance. Suddenly, a new sound broke the night's stillness. From the living room rug, Mr. Joseph's old dog lifted its head. A low, deep-throated growl rumbled in its chest. Its ears were pricked, its body tense, its gaze fixed on the front window. "Shh, Buster," Mr. Joseph whispered, placing a calming hand on the dog's head. But the dog was not to be calmed. It scrambled to its feet and let out a single sharp bark, then another. The old man rushed to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains. His body went rigid. "They're here," he breathed, his voice tight with urgency. A truck, no headlights, coming up the drive. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Elena's heart. They were out of time. The hunt had begun. Mr. Joseph grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "No time to think," he hissed. "Out the back. Now, go, go." He shoved her toward the back of the cottage, grabbing the canvas bag with the evidence and the heavy flashlight as he moved. She scooped Leo into her arms, his small body feeling impossibly heavy. Adrenaline surged through her, giving her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She followed Mr. Joseph through a small kitchen and out a back door into the pitch-black night. The cold air was a slap in the face. Just as the door clicked shut behind them, they heard the sound of a vehicle door slamming shut in the front of the mansion, followed by another. The sound was muffled by the woods, but still terrifyingly close. Mr. Joseph flicked on his flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a clean, white tunnel through the oppressive darkness of the trees. "This way," he commanded in a harsh whisper, "and be quiet. Your life depends on it." He plunged into the undergrowth, moving with a speed and confidence that belied his age. Elena followed, her heart pounding in her throat. Leo clinging to her neck like a limpet. The thorny branches of unseen bushes clawed at her clothes and her skin, but she barely felt it. They hadn't gone more than 50 yards into the woods when a loud crash echoed from the direction of the mansion. It was the unmistakable, splintering sound of a door being kicked in. The basement door. Elena flinched as if she had been struck. She could picture it perfectly. 2 burly figures, their faces set in grim masks, smashing their way into the damp, empty space. She could almost feel the violent intrusion, the desecration of the one place that had been, however miserably, hers. The sound was followed by a man's angry, shouted curse, the words indistinct, but the fury behind them, crystal clear. They had found the basement empty. Now they would be looking for her. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her, propelling her forward, stumbling through the dark after the bouncing beam of Mr. Joseph's flashlight. She could hear her own ragged breathing, and the terrified whimpers Leo was trying to stifle against her shoulder. The woods were no longer a shelter, they were a labyrinth, and a monster was at the entrance. Mr. Joseph led them on, his steps sure and steady. He didn't hesitate, weaving through the thick stands of pine and oak as if it were broad daylight. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick leaves and hidden roots, and Elena stumbled several times, catching herself just before she fell. The sounds from the mansion faded behind them, replaced by the natural noises of the woods at night, the chirping of crickets, the mournful hoot of a distant owl, and the sound of the wind whispering through the high branches. But these sounds offered no comfort. They only served to amplify the silence, to make her feel the immense, terrifying emptiness of the wilderness around them. They were utterly alone, fugitives in the dark, with only a frail old man and a beam of light to guide them. The canvas bag containing the truth bumped against Mr. Joseph's leg, a constant reminder of what was at stake, of why they were running for their lives through the cold, dark woods. Suddenly, new sounds broke the stillness. Shouts, angry voices carrying through the trees from the direction of the cottage. They had discovered Mr. Joseph's house was empty too. They were putting the pieces together. Then, she saw it. The sweeping arc of a powerful flashlight beam, cutting through the trees to their left, far brighter than Mr. Joseph's. Then another beam appeared to their right. They weren't just searching the house anymore. They were coming into the woods. They were spreading out, forming a search pattern. The hunters were in the forest with them. A choked sob escaped Elena's lips. Her legs felt like lead. Her lungs burned. She wanted to collapse, to give up, but the weight of Leo in her arms was a constant, desperate reminder of why she had to keep going. Mr. Joseph grabbed her hand, his own surprisingly warm and steady. "Don't you dare stop," he whispered fiercely, his voice a steel rod in the darkness. "We're almost there, just a little farther." He pulled her onward, half dragging her now, his energy seemingly limitless. The flashlight beams of their pursuers sliced through the darkness behind them, getting closer, the shouts more distinct. She could hear the heavy crashing of their bodies as they blundered through the undergrowth, clumsy and loud in their city shoes. They didn't know these woods, but they were faster. They were younger. It was a race, a desperate, primal race between ancient knowledge and brutal force. Elena could feel her strength failing, her vision starting to tunnel. The fear was so intense it was a physical agony, a burning in her chest and a roaring in her ears. She focused on the small circle of light at Mr. Joseph's feet, putting one foot in front of the other, an automaton powered by sheer terror and a mother's will to live. Just as she felt she could not take another step, Mr. Joseph stopped. His flashlight beam illuminated a narrow, overgrown path, barely visible in the darkness. "The old logging trail," he panted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was finally showing the strain. He pointed the flashlight down the dark, tunnel-like path. "Go. Don't stop running until you hit pavement. The town is 5 miles that way. Don't talk to anyone. Don't trust anyone. Go to the bus station and wait for my nephew's call." He thrust the canvas bag into her hands. "This is your life now," he said, his voice grave. "Guard it." Behind them, the voices were closer, the flashlight beams brighter. A man shouted, "Over here, I think I see something." There was no time. Eleanor looked at the old man, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so immense it was painful. He had saved them. This stranger, this survivor, had risked everything for her and her son. There were no words. She just nodded, her eyes locking with his for a brief final moment. In his gaze, she saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else. Triumph. The hope of a 50-year-old justice, finally about to be born. She turned and ran. The run was a blind, desperate flight through a nightmare of tangled branches and grasping thorns. Elena's lungs burned, each ragged gasp a searing pain in her chest. The heavy weight of Leo in her arms was an anchor, but also her only reason for moving, for forcing her screaming muscles to obey. The canvas bag containing the truth bumped rhythmically against her hip, a constant, heavy reminder of the stakes. Behind them, the angry shouts and the sweeping beams of flashlights grew fainter, swallowed by the immense, indifferent darkness of the woods. Mr. Joseph's sacrifice had bought them time. After an eternity of stumbling over hidden roots and slick leaves, the trees thinned. She saw it then, the smooth black ribbon of a paved road, shimmering faintly under the moonlight. She collapsed onto the grassy verge, her body trembling with exhaustion, and a relief so profound it felt like a physical agony. The cold, clean air filled her lungs, a shocking contrast to the suffocating damp of the basement that had been her home. It was the first breath of freedom. The bus station was a fluorescent-lit purgatory, smelling of stale coffee, disinfectant, and the quiet desperation of transient lives. Elena found a dark corner, pulling a sleeping Leo onto her lap, trying to make them both as small and invisible as possible. Every new person who entered sent a fresh jolt of paranoia through her, her eyes scanning for any sign of a tailored suit or cold, blue eyes. She felt exposed, a raw nerve ending in a world of strangers. The minutes stretched into an agonizing hour. Then, too, the cheap phone she'd bought with a fraction of Davies's tainted money felt like a dead weight in her pocket. Just as a new wave of hopelessness began to wash over her, it vibrated. The sound made her jump. She fumbled to answer, her voice a dry whisper. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and utterly reassuring. It was Mr. Joseph's nephew. He had an address. He told her a car was 5 minutes away. Eleanor felt the rigid knot of terror in her stomach finally begin to loosen. Help was real. It was coming. The car dropped them in front of a nondescript city brownstone, a world away from the rural decay of the Caldwell estate. Inside, she was ushered into a warm, book-lined office that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a kind smile introduced herself as Sarah Jenkins, a senior attorney for the Legal Justice Initiative. With trembling hands, Eleanor unzipped the canvas bag and laid its contents on the polished mahogany desk. The anciently fragile diary and the bundle of yellowed letters looked impossibly out of place, sacred relics in a modern temple of law. As Elena recounted the story, from the eviction to the basement to Davies's chilling threat, Sarah listened without interruption, her expression hardening from sympathy to a cold-fired, focused anger. Halfway through her story, the door opened and Mr. Joseph was escorted in. He looked exhausted, but his eyes lit up when he saw her and Leo. Safe. His presence in that room was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. The truth now had a living voice. What followed was a whirlwind of controlled, efficient action that left Elena breathless. Sarah Jenkins and her team descended upon the evidence like a scholarly army. The fragile papers were carefully photographed, scanned, and placed in archival sleeves. The nephew, whose name was Marcus, worked with a furious intensity, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he cross-referenced the names from Caldwell's diary with public records. Phone calls were made, hushed and urgent, to historians who specialized in the post-Reconstruction South, to land deed experts who could spot a 50-year-old forgery, to genealogists who could trace the scattered diaspora of Freeman's Hope. Eleanor sat on a comfortable sofa, a warm mug of tea in her hands, watching this incredible machine spring to life. For the first time, she felt the balance of power shift. She was no longer a terrified mouse hiding from a predator. She was the spark, and she had just handed her torch to a team of dragon slayers. An army was assembling, and its target was J.D. Davies. Weeks later, Sarah showed her the video on a laptop. It was raw security footage, grainy and silent, but its power was absolute. A fleet of black government sedans had converged on the gleaming glass tower of Davies' development downtown. Federal agents, their faces grim and impassive, flowed into the lobby with a quiet, unstoppable purpose. The camera cut to a glass-walled boardroom on the top floor. J.D. Davies was there, laughing, his back to the door, a picture of arrogant, untouchable power. The moment the agents entered the room, the laughter died. The change in him was catastrophic. The mask of suave confidence shattered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a mask of pure, snarling rage. The sight of the handcuffs being clipped onto his tailored wrists was a moment of pure, cathartic satisfaction. As he was led away, his empire crumbling around him, Elena felt not vengeance, but a profound sense of rightness, as if a great and terrible weight had finally been lifted from the world. The arrest was only the beginning. The story exploded in the press, a sordid tale of greed, racism, and a 50-year-old crime finally brought to light. Arthur Caldwell's diary was a sensation. Its pages printed in newspapers, its anguished confession a voice from the grave that could not be denied. Inspired by the news and contacted by Sarah's team, other descendants of Freeman's Hope began to emerge from the woodwork. A grandmother in Chicago, a pastor in Atlanta, a history professor in California, all of them children or grandchildren of the families Davies's father had driven out. Their voices joined Mr. Joseph's, creating a powerful chorus of testimony that dismantled J.D. Davies's web of lies and intimidation. In court, the case was overwhelming. The judge declared the original land seizure a criminal conspiracy, voiding every deed and title that had been built upon that first, violent sin. The land, all of it, was ordered to be returned to a trust formed by the descendants of its rightful owners. Elena sat in Sarah Jenkins's sunlit office, the sounds of the city a distant hum below. Mr. Joseph sat beside her, his hand resting on Leo's shoulder. The board of the Freeman's Hope Descendants Trust had met. Sarah slid a pale blue check across the mahogany desk. "They wanted you to have this," she said softly, "as a reward for your bravery, for being the keeper of the truth when it would have been so much easier to run." Eleanor picked it up, her fingers numb. She stared at the number written in crisp, black ink. It was an impossible figure, an amount of money that her mind couldn't fully comprehend. It was enough to buy a house, a car, enough to start her own business. It was enough to ensure Leo would never know the cold terror of poverty, of hunger, of a mattress on a damp floor. Hot tears welled in her eyes and streamed down her face, but these were not the silent, bitter tears of despair she had cried in the basement. These were tears of pure, unadulterated joy, a cleansing rain washing away a lifetime of fear. The living room was filled with golden afternoon light, the warm, clean scent of fresh paint, a perfume of new beginnings. Sunlight streamed through a large, sparkling, clean window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, joyful sprites. This was her house, her living room. The words themselves were a miracle. In the corner stood a magnificent, brand-new sewing machine, its chrome parts gleaming with promise. Eleanor ran a hand over its smooth, cool surface, the gesture a silent vow to herself. She would create again. She would build a new life, stitch by stitch. From the backyard, she heard a sound that was more precious than all the money in the world. The pure, uninhibited peal of Leo's laughter as he chased a soccer ball across a lawn of thick green grass. A joy so fierce and profound, it was painful washed over her. She had not just saved him from a monster, she had given him back his childhood. Her heart, which had felt like a cold, heavy stone for so long, was now light, full and soaring. The scent of roasting chicken and garlic filled the warm air of the kitchen, a stark contrast to the memory of gnawing hunger and the ghostly smell of other people's dinners. Her own small dining table was set for 3. Leo, his face flushed with happiness from playing outside, chattered excitedly. Mr. Joseph, their guest of honor, sat at the head of the table, his old eyes crinkling in a warm smile that seemed to light up the whole room. As Elena brought the steaming platter to the table, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. Her hands, which had once trembled with fear and cold, were now steady. She served her son, piling his plate high, a simple act of maternal love that now felt like the ultimate victory. She looked at her son's happy, healthy face, at the kind, wise face of the man who had become their family, and she felt a quiet, powerful sense of rightness. They were safe. They were nourished. They were finally, truly home. The ghosts of the past had been vanquished by a simple, shared meal in a house filled with light. She looked out her new window at the peaceful glow of the streetlights, a universe away from the terrifying, predatory darkness of the Caldwell estate. The low, steady hum of her own refrigerator was a comforting promise of abundance, not a sinister countdown to homelessness. Her life, once a frantic, desperate struggle for mere survival, was now a beautiful, blank canvas, and she held the needle and thread to create its future. Elena's story proves that the deepest darkness cannot extinguish the light of a single, courageous soul, and that justice, though it may sleep for generations, can be awakened by one person who dares to speak the truth. Her journey from the depths of despair to this moment of peace is a testament to the enduring power of a mother's will. What future will you choose to build from the ashes of your own past? If you believe in the power of justice and stories of redemption, ensure you are subscribed to our channel with all notifications turned on. You won't want to miss the incredible journeys we have waiting for you.